Good day and welcome to Mrs. B Teaches English. Today we are looking at the poem An African Thunderstorm by David Rubadiri. And I really don't want to say too much about it beforehand. I want the poem to speak for itself. So let's jump in and have a look. We're first going to discuss the poet. David Rubadiri was a poet, a novelist, a playwright, a university professor, and a diplomat. He was born in Malawi in 1930 and educated at King's College in Uganda. He also later studied in England, earning a Master of Arts in Literature. After Malawi's independence in 1964, Rubadiri was appointed as Malawi's first ambassador to the USA and to the UN. A disagreement with the Malawian president of the time, however, saw him leave the government in 1965 and go into exile. After the president's death in 1997, Rubadiri was reappointed as ambassador. Rubadiri taught at various universities in Africa, and some of them even included Uganda. His poetry has been praised as being among the richest of contemporary Africa and shows a combination of African influences and European poetical forms. His very simple style makes his poetry accessible and enjoyable to a lot of people. And he really wrote a lot of post-colonial literature. Now, you will remember that post-colonial literature focuses on the effects of colonization on various territories. So let's read through the poem together. An African Thunderstorm by David Rubadiri. From the west, clouds came hurrying with the wind, turning sharply here and there like a plague of locusts, whirling, tossing up things on its tail like a madman chasing nothing. Pregnant clouds ride stately on its back, gathering to perch on hills like dark sinister wings. The wind whistles by, and trees bend to let it pass. In the village, screams of delighted children toss and turn in the din of the whirling wind. Women, babies clinging on their backs, dart about, in and out, madly. The wind whistles by, whilst trees bend to let it pass. Clothes wave like tattered flags, flying off to expose dangling breasts as jagged, blinding flashes rumble, tremble, and crack amidst the smell of fired smoke and the pelting march of the storm. So, in essence, this poem opens with a storm and winds and thunderclouds blowing in from the west, violently churning up items in its path. The storm's senseless destruction is like that of an invading insect, like the biblical plague of locusts, or like an insane person running after nothing. The speaker describes the clouds that ride the wind as pregnant and stately, implying that they are full of rain and possibly full of an ominous significance, but are grand-looking as well. These clouds, however, hover over the hilltops like dark wings of some evil creature, the trees bending in the path of the strong wind that passes by. The poem then turns to the responses of the villagers in the storm's path. Children scream with excitement, and the noise is blown around by the wind as it churns. Women frantically scramble, rushing in and out of doors as they are carrying their babies fearfully, and nearby trees continue to bend in the strong wind. The women's clothing is ripped off by the storm, exposing their naked bodies, and then waves in the wind like torn-up flags come. Lightning flashes vividly, thunder rumbles the ground, the air smells like fire and smoke, and a violent rain begins. And that's where the poem ends. So it's important, taking into consideration that this is a post-colonial poem, that you will remember this poem is written on 2 levels. Very literally, we can say that this is a poem about a thunderstorm in Africa, in a rural village. But on a more figurative level, there are clues that indicate that this is also a poem about the coming of the colonizer and everything that the colonizer represents, and the effects that were left afterwards. So it's very important as we read, I want you to constantly think of both these. Don't only think, oh, it's a thunderstorm. I want you to think, so what does this mean in terms of the colonizer that came? How did that affect the people? Right, so yes, we can definitely say that this is a poem about a village that is clearly vulnerable to the force of the storm, but also to the force of colonial domination on this native land. Let's jump into a line-by-line analysis. The poem starts by describing an African thunderstorm that we have in the title. It says that the storm approaches from the west. And already in the very first 5 lines, we see that the poem's form, the structure, reflects its content. Like the wind blowing here and there, the verse is all over the place. The lines vary considerably in length. For example, they are broken up by this choppy enjambment. Some of them are long, some of them are short, and we have the enjambment going throughout. And this variability really creates that unsettling rhythm suited to the image of the storm. It is unpredictable. It's hurrying, but we don't know when it's going to arrive. We also have single-worded lines, you will see, as we have turning sharply. This gives that sharp and dramatic effect, and it really turns up the tension. So from the west literally means that the storm is approaching from the western skies. However, this also suggests on a symbolic meaning that the west is a political term often applied to Europe and the former European colonies. So especially the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, that retain a majority population of European descent. This west has caused centuries of violence and upheaval across the African continent, from the North Atlantic slave trade through to the era of the African colonization, through to the post-colonial period. The storm can therefore be read as a symbol of that violence. This possible meaning might have struck the reader as especially relevant from the time of the poem's first publication, when many African countries had recently gained or were still fighting for independence from European colonial powers. Rubadiri's own country, Malawi, gained independence from the UK during this period, 1964. Rubadiri also used this directional west as a symbol for the political west in other poetry from the same time, including that of things like the tide that from the west washes Africa to the bone. If you have a chance, read that and you will see. Okay, so then clouds come hurrying with the wind. So the clouds are gathering very quickly, and this frantic movement captures the build-up of this unpredictable nature of the storm. Turning sharply, 2 very short lines, single-worded lines, emphasize the unpredictable nature of the wind. It was blowing in different directions, here and there. So we have juxtaposition here and there. 2 opposite ideas being placed close to each other. This emphasizes the constant changing direction of the wind. It implies that the storm is powerful and also it is imminent. So it's going to happen soon. We just don't know when. Then we find some comparisons. Like a plague of locusts whirling So lines 6 to 9 now represents or present two similes that drive home the sinister nature of the storm. The speaker first compares the storm to a plague of locusts whirling, and then later we will see to that of a scary phenomenon, a madman chasing nothing. So on the most literal level, these lines really describe the extremely strong winds that are churning dark clouds around in the air, almost like a cyclone or a hurricane. The storm is also churning up debris from the ground, so it's picking up all of these debris as if they were an insect swarm, tossing up things on its tail. So the mentioning of the locusts, the plague here, of course, suggests this dark swirling mass. So it's not just one or two. There's a whole swarm of locusts. And if you've ever seen them, and if you know anything about them, you will know that the farmers really, really get worried when they see these locusts, because they know they just leave destruction in their path. So we have a simile here. The storm is being compared to a plague of locusts, showing how destructive it is, showing how powerful it is. Okay, but now we have some other symbolic connotations that I want to leave with you. The fact that he mentions these locusts, right? Real swarms of locusts sometimes occur in the Middle East and in Africa, and it really does have a devastating effect on the crops. So here it indicates how devastating the storm will be. Like thunderstorms themselves, the locusts are vivid illustrations of nature's power over human beings. We are really powerless in the face of nature, right? Then insects really feature prominently as symbols of doom and destruction throughout literary history. Perhaps the most famous example of this would be the plague of locusts in the biblical book of Exodus, where it's one of the divinely ordained disasters that helped to free the Israelites from slavery. So I want you to keep this symbolic meaning of the locusts in the back of your mind. Then we move on, tossing up things on its tail like a madman chasing nothing. So here we're talking about a true mad person, right? Somebody that has no sense, no direction. And that is what we get here. The storm is unpredictable. It has no direction. It cannot be predicted where it's going next. And again, the fact that it's tossing up things on its tail emphasizes the destructive power of the storm. So we can say that there's a simile again. The storm is being compared to a madman chasing nothing. We cannot predict the movement or the direction of the wind. So this helps us to characterize the wind that is coming. And I think it's the same with the colonizer that we're talking about here. They couldn't predict what they would do either. They've heard maybe stories, but the people didn't know what would happen once the colonizer arrives. So the first part of this poem, the storm is symbolic of the arrival of the Europeans or the colonizers that came from the west. They colonized Africa, I think, very quickly. If you think that it was something that they saw coming and then suddenly they were here. They could not understand or predict the movement of these colonizers. They didn't know what was going to happen. And it did cause a great deal of upheaval for the natives. Now we move on to the next part of the poem. Pregnant clouds ride stately on its back. So we have some personification or a metaphor in the form of personification here. Lines 10 to 15 present a nightmarish, fantastical, almost surreal mix of images. They compare the thunder clouds first to pregnant creatures that ride stately on the wind, and then to dark wings of some evil creature perching on the hills. Meanwhile, the wind is so strong that it whistles and forces trees to bend. So these shifting descriptions make the clouds seem almost like a shape-shifting figure from mythology. They are metaphorically pregnant with rain, but also seemingly with a deeper significance. They might call to mind any number of legendary figures that bear these monstrous children or approach on horseback, right? So like royalty riding on a horseback of the apocalypse, or perching in sinister fashion like scavenger birds. Think of vultures. We had that ominous idea of the perching birds. The ambiguity is part of the point here. The reader is free to project their fears onto these vague, sinister presences. And the bottom line is that the clouds spell out trouble, that there's trouble coming, whether it be the storm or the colonizer. In the next lines, the alliteration and the assonance of wings and wind and whistles will really help to evoke that rushing, whistling sound of the wind with the W, right? The whoo that blows through your lips. Like the clouds, the trees that bend to let it pass are personified. It's as if they are bowing in the presence of this stately passing royalty, or simply ducking to get out of the way of danger. So these clouds are being compared to something that is pregnant, a lady, and of course they are pregnant with what? With rain. So that is to say that the storm is about to start. Then the clouds are being compared to royalty, or something that is proud, that is sitting upright and full of dignity, riding on the wind, riding stately, proudly, with dignity on the wind. So this is really ironic because the wind caused damage on the ground, and that the clouds are not affected by the wind. It's not like the clouds show any form of fear or retaliation to the wind. Again, emphasizing the power of nature, and that nature will stand together. So these clouds are gathering to perch on hills. It's almost like they are on top of the hills, like sinister dark wings. We have that simile again. The storm is compared to sinister dark wings, so evil birds. This really creates that ominous feeling. And the wind whistles by. So here we find the onomatopoeia. The sound of the wind emphasizes the force of the wind. And trees bend to let it pass. So there's some personification again here. A person would really bow to somebody that is superior. The trees here are associated with strength, but even the trees are bowing to the power of the wind, indicating how strong the wind is. So the local people can be compared to these trees as well. And then the storm would be the colonizer, and the local people, just like the trees, would bow to the stronger force. So whether it be the wind or then the colonizer, they had to bow down to submit to the power. Then we go on to lines 16 to 19. So now we get to see how the people in the village really react to the coming of the colonizer or the storm. We shift to the village in the path of the storm. For the first time, human beings now enter the poem that has been dominated by nature, as if to maximize the contrast. The poet first shows the readers children and then the adults, maybe because the children would be the most vulnerable humans. In an almost unsettling touch of dramatic irony, we see that the children are delighted. They are the only ones that don't really show fear because they are ignorant in this regard. They don't know, they don't realize the imminent danger that they are facing. Perhaps we can say they are naive to the danger that is coming. And it's also in contrast with the frantic movement of the mothers in the village, the adults who do know. So disturbingly, the children's delight is expressed in the screams that the wind tosses and turns. In other words, that delight may contain an undertone of anxiety maybe, and may turn into screams of terror if the storm gets bad enough. Again, bear in mind what the storm represents. Meanwhile, the storm takes no notice of them and drowns out its own in the din or noisy chaos. This again suggests the merciless nature, or symbolically, the Western powers that have transformed Africa, as well as the comparative frailty and vulnerability of the villagers. We find some alliteration in these lines, toss and turn, whirling wind, and some assonance as well in the din of the whirling wind, the sound there, and these really emphasize the noisy nature of the wind. The enjambments here are erratic in line length, some are much longer than others, and this also reflects the way that the storm breaks off sounds and whirls them around randomly. The lines feel as loud and chaotic as the storm itself, in other words. So in the village, screams of delighted children. The children are excited by this impending storm. To them, it's exciting to see the storm coming. They are unaware of the danger. Toss and turn in the din of the whirling wind. So we can hear the mixed screams with the sound of the wind. It tosses and turns it all over. Then we have some really short lines that follow with a longer line in between. Women, babies clinging on their backs, dart about in and out madly. So in contrast to the children, we see that the women have a sense of urgency or frantic movement that they portray. There's a sense of panic in this part of the poem. We have the short lines that convey the urgency of the movement, and then that longer line that makes it seem all chaotic. The women here are aware of the dangers, in contrast to the children. The wind whistles by, and trees bend to let it pass. So here we have the poem repeating lines 14 and 15 almost verbatim. The only difference is and becomes whilst, and which is a variant of while that is fairly common in the British English. On the one hand, whilst simply adds to the alliteration in the phrase, wind whistles, but it also makes the rushing whistling sound even louder as the storm builds. The shift from and to whilst can also suggest ongoing movement. So it just continues. There's nothing that can stop it. The repetition of these two lines really serves two purposes. First, it conveys the repetitive movement of the gusting wind and thrashing trees, and it reminds the reader that there's this oncoming storm in the backdrop to all the frantic motion of the village. And secondly, it suggests the steadfast continuity of the trees as they withstand the wind's force. So they are still opposing the force, just like the people. They are opposing the oppression. The storm may transform or wreck other features of the landscape, especially the vulnerable human village. But these personified trees just keep on letting it pass. No doubt they've survived other storms like it in the past, and they will survive storms in the future. Now let's replace the trees with humans. They've also withstand previous storms in the past or attacks, and they will in the future. The trees let the wind pass, but man is still trying to resist. At the end, we will see that the resistance will be futile. Clothes wave like tattered flags. So we have a simile again. Their clothing is being compared to torn flags. It's flapping. The speaker really underscores the ferocity of the storm, whose winds are strong enough to tear the clothes off the women of the village. So more than ever, human beings seem to be vulnerable or exposed in the face of nature's power. These women are protecting their babies, but they seem to have very little protection themselves. Also, it's significant that the men of the village are unmentioned. So the women are darting in and out of the homes, but there's no real mentioning of the men. It can be just coincidental, or it can be more symbolic of how vulnerable they were at that point in time. These lines also suggest various other symbolic features or political interpretations. The torn clothes, for instance, are compared to tattered flags, an image that suggests political crisis and transformation. If we look at the historical background, the poem first appeared as Rubadiri's home country of Malawi was transforming from a British colony into an independent state. That those flags are flying off thus might represent a loss of national or cultural identity, which might be liberating, distressing, or perhaps both. Those flags may refer to the flags of colonizers being torn down and ripped up in the course of the rebellion or uprising. In this reading, we see that colonialism isn't just violent in itself, but also sets the stage for later violence and unrest as colonial subjects fight for their independence. Or perhaps those tattered flags speak to the colonized people's national and cultural identities, which colonialism destroys. Either way, there's clearly some violence and chaos involved. The ripping off of clothes might also suggest assault or violation. For example, the military invasions and sexual violence that infamously accompanied these colonizers. It might also suggest a loss of material comfort or a loss of civilization and return to almost primitive state. This in turn might recall the way that some colonizers scorned African societies as primitive while pillaging their cultural riches. Overall, it's a very disturbing image that sets up this ominous, militaristic image of the final lines, the smell of the fired smoke, and the pelting march of the storm. So, the clothes go flying off to expose dangling breasts. The wind is extremely strong, and it strips the people of their dignity. If we look at clothing, it's really something that we wear for the sake of dignity, and also for the sake of protection. And once that is removed, we have no protection. We almost feel like our dignity has been affected by it as well. So again, coming back to the power of nature, but also the power of the colonizer. As jagged, blinding flashes rumble, tremble, and crack. So, of course, we return to the idea of the storm. Line 30 to 33 conclude the poem with images of thunder, lightning, and driving rain. The clouds have opened up and it began to drench the village. The sound effects of the assonance in jagged flashes crack, and the consonants rumble, tremble, and the onomatopoeia rumble, tremble, and crack really help to conjure up this explosive, reverberating noise of the storm. These lines also provide the poem's very first scent-related imagery, describing the smell of the fired smoke in the air. What's causing this odor is unclear. Are these fires burning outdoors or indoors? We can also ask, are they being extinguished by the rain? Readers don't know for sure, and the uncertainty really makes the image, like many other images in this poem, ominous and unsettling. The smoky smell might also be another sign of destruction to come, or it might be an image of human survival during the very turbulent times. The pelting march of the storm. Line 33 makes the storm sound like an invading army, as if the storm is making war on the villagers, making us think of that image again of the colonizer. The smell of fired smoke, or whatever its real cause, might be evocative of gun smoke even. The poem breaks off very abruptly here, so it's impossible to know whether or to what extent the village withstands the devastation. Again, all of these elements highlight the power of nature over humans and their lives, and then also mirror other forms of violence and instability Africa has suffered, particularly at the hands of the West. So let's go through it just line by line again. Like we said, there's a lot of onomatopoeia, sound devices. There's this very vivid description of lightning that emphasizes that there's a lot of lightning here. The onomatopoeia really describes the intensity of the thunder. Then we have, amidst the smell of fired smoke and the pelting march of the storm. And it's almost like it ends there in the middle of the sentence, like there's something else that was supposed to be added. Amidst the smell of the fired smoke, of course, fired smoke there, negative connotation. So it can be that maybe a tree was struck by lightning and now the fire is spreading and we can smell the smoke, or it can be gun smoke, like I said. And the pelting march of the storm. The pelting march there indicates that it might be an army, or that the storm is raging war on this village, and it's moving forward, so, and continuing with intensity and unpredictability and a lot of destructive elements. And that is where the poem stops, right before we see what the outcome was of this storm or war. So we can just summarize that last part saying that, of course, the natives were enslaved and stripped of their dignity. There's a loss of identity, the flags that were tattered, the clothes flying off. The thunder and the lightning is symbolic of perhaps gunfire and the battles that were to follow. If we just very quickly look at tone, there's of course an overall tone of dismay. The author is not very happy, concentrates on telling us about all of the damage caused by the rain and the wind and the plague of locusts. Even though rain is often seen as a blessing, right? Everything loves the approach of rain, not just the children, but not the storm. The storm causes destruction and is therefore not good. We can also identify some tones in specific stanzas. Stanza 2, we can say there's this tone of impending destruction, and we get that when the clouds are compared to birds of prey. Stanza 3, we can say is a panic or apprehension. The way that the women run around, there's clearly some panic going on. And then stanza 4, destruction. The guns, the smoke that we smell really indicate destructive powers there. Themes. We have two main themes that we're going to focus on. The one is the power and unpredictability of nature. Nature has potential to be destructive, and there's one thing that you don't mess with, and that's the power of nature, because you will lose. So the description of this very threatening thunderstorm illustrates the potentially destructive power of nature. The unpredictable wind brings with it the ominous clouds with their power to unleash the force on this rural African village. And of course, you will get some lines to support that. Then, vulnerability in the face of power or oppression. Remember, we said we are reading this poem on two levels, and figuratively, we can look at the storm as the approaching colonizer, which would then also mean oppression. In terms of structure and form, An African Thunderstorm is a free verse poem that does not follow any specific form. It emerged from a period when many East African poets were abandoning these traditional English forms with their very strict meter as perhaps a gesture of independence from their former colonizers. That said, the poem contains a number of interesting formal features that evoke the wildness of the storm and the frantic movement of the villagers. For example, the lines vary in length, and then we have the irregularity and the unpredictability that is fit for the turmoil of the scene. The short lines, with the frequent enjambments and the lack of expected punctuation, also gives the verse a breathless quality that mirrors the breathless anticipation of the villagers. It is as if the text itself is chaotically blowing around the wind. At the same time, there's the regularity in the way each stanza comes to rest on a period. Each one of them ends on a full stop, as if the poem were pausing to catch its breath. Also note that there are two stanzas with that end with the wind whistles and trees bend to let it pass, making this phrase almost like a refrain that is very traditional. This repeated image highlights a contrast between the frantic humans and their natural environment. For the trees, these storms aren't unique disasters, but really just repetitive events that can be easily withstood. In terms of meter, an African Thunderstorm does not use regular meter. It's written in free verse. There's marked short lines, frequent enjambments. The longest lines in the poem contain 8 syllables, while the shortest contain only 2. The irregular line lengths and the unpredictable verse really reflects the chaotic nature of the storm, as we've said before. And at the same time, the verse contains some very interesting rhythmic qualities. Many of the lines begin with a stress syllable, as in the first stanza, clouds come turning sharply here and there. This gives the poem a punchy, almost percussive quality, appropriate to the destructive nature of the violent storm. And then we can say that we can break down the structure in terms of certain parts of the storm that are being mentioned in certain stanzas. So stanza 1 and 2 really describes how the storm gathers momentum and shows us some qualities of the potentially dangerous storm. Then stanza 3 continues to depict the noise and the movement of the villagers, how the people react, while stanza 4 is the ending of the poem, and it ends with the storm breaking but stops before it actually hits. So the progress of the pelting marching storm tells the reader that the storm cannot be stopped, in other words. So let's just quickly look in terms of figures of speech. We have metaphors and similes and personification throughout the poem. Most of the poem's figurative language occurs in the form of similes, but it also contains several metaphors. For example, the thunderclouds are metaphorically pregnant. They're heavy with rain, and they're about to release, and apparently with some very larger significance as well. So the speaker also says that these pregnant clouds ride stately on the back of the wind. That is, the wind blows them along, and they look impressive and grand as they approach. I want you to note that both these metaphors are more specifically a kind of personification than just not just a metaphor, but also personification. This in turn supports an allegorical reading of the poem wherein the storm then represents the looming threat of political violence. Another important metaphor also occurs in the last line, which describes the pelting march of the storm. As the thunderstorm advances and brings a hard-driving rain, the speaker compares it to a marching army that's pelting the village with bullets or other projectiles. This imagery subtly links the storm with other forms of violence Africa has suffered during its history. Okay, then similes. We have four similes. The first three really indicate like the characteristics of the storm. First, the cloud-bearing winds are turning like a plague of locusts. Then they are whirling and tossing up debris like a madman. And finally, the clouds are gathering to perch on hills like sinister wings. These three comparisons help the reader to visualize the storm rushing towards this little village. At the same time, they characterize the storm as an ominous force or a senseless destruction, even a threat to the survival of the community. And in particular, the biblical plague of locusts suggests this almost apocalyptic threat. Though the plague of Egypt's story concerns the freeing of the people, as well as the devastation of another, this poem focuses on the violence in Africa. The fourth simile illustrates the storm's effect on the village women, whose clothes wave like tattered flags while flying off to expose dangling breasts. The image of the tattered dangling breasts and the flags really links to the storm and its political violence and the change that would come. The exposure of the village women is disturbing. It's a complex image, and on a literal level, it illustrates the terrible power of the storm, but on a very symbolic level, it primarily suggests violation, the stripping away of physical protection, privacy, and culture. Again, this would align with the reading of the poem as a critique of Western political violence. In terms of sound devices, it's also rich. We have alliteration and assonance and onomatopoeia. I'm going to discuss two of them. Alliteration, the poem uses frequent alliteration to help evoke the sound of the storm. In particular, it uses the W sound, the W sound, to capture that rushing, whistling wind, the west wind, whirling wings. If we zoom in on lines 19 and 20, notice how the whirling wind, women, also links the wind and the women, nature and humans, thematically, and then also as they rush about. The many T sounds in the poem add to the sense of a mounting chaos, with words such as turning and tossing and tail. Alliteration can also help to simply draw some attention to certain images in the poem, like babies and backs. These babies are clinging so tightly to their mom's backs that it's as if they are fused together, a connection that is shared by this B sound that helps to emphasize how close they are. Onomatopoeia. African Thunderstorm uses onomatopoeia several times to evoke the sound of the storm. The breathy W and the sibilant S sounds of whistle really mimic the high-pitched sound of the wind. And then later we have words like rumble, tremble, crack, which have harsh sounds evoking thunder and lightning. As with whistles, these words really echo by surrounding the non-onomatopoeia words with similar vowel or consonant sounds like jagged, flashes, tremble. In particular, rumble and tremble sounds like an extended reverberation. These sounds affects really the visual representation of the poem. Coming back to personification, the poem describes the storm through a variety of metaphors and similes, and some of them involve personification. First, the clouds and the wind come hurrying, as if they're in a rush to reach the village. Then they're compared to a madman chasing nothing. These phrases establish a mood of tension, anxiety, and even frenzy in the poem. They depict nature as violent, irrational, and a force that is capable of swift destruction. Immediately afterward, the clouds are personified as pregnant women riding stately on the wind. The comparison suggests that there is a grandeur to this force of nature, even as it remains sinister. Visually, the storm seems to slow and pause over the village. It's full of rain, but also heavy with significance, bringing a great and ominous change that will soon be born. These trees are personified too. They bend to let the storm pass. On the literal level, this image shows that the wind is strong enough to bend the tree trunks, but the personification suggests that the trees, as part of nature, are strong and flexible enough to withstand the storm, even if they have to defer to its great strength. So they can bend. It's the humans who are vulnerable enough to break. This might also suggest that the African land is less vulnerable than the African people to things like colonization. The poem's final phrase suggests that personification is also present. The pelting march of the storm sounds like an attacking army. Here again, nature and or the political West is imagined as a violent and invasive force. Then we're going to look at repetition. So the poem uses repetition to depict the storm as an unstoppable force. Nothing can stop it. It just continues. Both the first and second stanzas, for example, begin with the image of the storm clouds on the wind, setting a mood of tension and anticipation. In fact, the poem mentions the wind 4 separate times as if to emphasize its relentlessness. The speaker also uses the adjective whirling twice, and in doing so evokes the cyclical wind itself, the way it swirls around and around and around. An entire phrase then repeats almost verbatim at the end of the second and third stanzas. The wind whistles by and trees bend to let it pass. Later it becomes the wind whistles by whilst trees bend to let it pass. On the one hand, this repetition reminds the readers of the wind's arrival and evokes the intense thrashing motion of the trees. At the same time, this slight tweak in the wording, moving from and to whilst, subtly suggests that the storm has grown more powerful and insistent, actively pushing through the trees, even as they try to bend and let it pass. And then lastly, we can get very, very extreme and say that the poem contains 12 present participles, or ing verbs, that function as verbs or adjectives. So we have hurrying, turning, whirling, tossing, chasing, gathering, whirling, clinging, flying, dangling, blinding, and pelting. Right? This pile-up of words signify the ongoing action. It really creates that impression of constant, frantic motion, in other words. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation on African Thunderstorm and that it will help you to revise for the exams.